Lesson 2, Dirayat al-Hadith and Other Disciplines of Hadith. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma akhrijna min zulumatil wahm wa akrimna binuril fahm. Allahumma aftah alayna abwaba rahmatik wanshur alayna khazaina ulumik. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Welcome to Lesson 2, Dirayat al-Hadith and Other Disciplines of Hadith of the course Hadith 2 on Dirayat al-Hadith. In the previous lesson, we have discussed about the meaning and definitions of Dirayat al-Hadith. And in general, we have learned that Dirayat al-Hadith is a discipline concerned with issues that contribute to a more reliable narration, a more accurate understanding, and a more precise evaluation of Hadith. We dealt with the definitions of Sunni scholars, as which may be classified into three, namely Ibn Kafani's definition, Ibn Jama'ah's definition, and Tashkupri Zada's definition. Some contemporary scholars of Dirayat al-Hadith take all disciplines of Hadith, 6 such disciplines as they have listed, to be sub-disciplines of Dirayat al-Hadith. But early scholars took all issues discussed in Dirayat al-Hadith to be an independent discipline without making any demarcations between them. For instance, one important branch of Dirayat al-Hadith is the science of Rijal, or knowledge of the narrators of Hadith, especially with respect to their reliability. Many issues of which, such as concerning the classes and names of narrators, are separate from and additional to issues of Dirayat al-Hadith. The indeterminacy of the boundary between Dirayat al-Hadith and other disciplines of Hadith has led to confusions about the date when the first work in Dirayat al-Hadith has been written. Whereas some independent works concerning some sub-disciplines of Dirayat al-Hadith date back to sometime before the 4th century or 10th century Common Era. The first independent work in Dirayat al-Hadith is taken to be that of Ram Hormuzi, which is written in 360 after Hijrah or 970 Common Era. With regard to the relation between Riwayat al-Hadith and Dirayat al-Hadith, it should be said that the relation between Dirayat al-Hadith and the text of Hadith has sometimes been taken to be like the relation between the exegesis or tafsir and the text that it interprets, or that between judgments and events. And sometimes it has been taken to be like the relation between principles of jurisprudence or usul al-fiqh and jurisprudence or fiqh, or nahu, Arabic grammar, and i'rab, that is modulation of words and declensions. The classification of hadith-related disciplines into fiqh al-hadith, that is about understanding of hadith, the science of Rijal, and Dirayat al-Hadith is a recent classification that has come to be widely accepted and known. Though this has been an attempt to improve upon the extant classifications of the disciplines of Hadith, there are reservations about its applicability to and inclusiveness of all disciplines of Hadith as they are conceived by early scholars. Notwithstanding this, there is no doubt that some scholars have long been attentive to the distinction between issues of Dirayat al-Hadith and the science of Rijal. In addition to the science of Rijal and Dirayat al-Hadith, another Hadith-related discipline has also been mentioned as Ilmul Asnad, or science about the chains of transmission. And the former two have sporadically been taken to be its subdisciplines, though they take them all to be independent of one another. It is obvious that for some non-Sunni scholars, Dirayat al-Hadith and the science of Rijal are not identical. They are completely independent. Thus, these scholars did not take the science of Rijal to be part of Dirayat al-Hadith and took discussions about the chains of narrators of Hadith in the science of Rijal and Dirayat al-Hadith to be of totally different characters. In the latter, the general principles governing chains are discussed, and in the former, that is Rijal, individual instances of the narrators are considered, as to say whether they are reliable or not. In practice, however, since Dirayat al-Hadith draws upon the results of the science of Rijal, it is common for some issues of the science of Rijal to be discussed in Dirayat al-Hadith, such as al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, that is taking a narrator as reliable or unreliable, introduction of trustworthy books of the science of Rijal, and contradictions in reports about a narrator of Hadith. This discipline has also been called Ulumul Hadith, Mustalahul Hadith, and Usulul Hadith. Among non-Sunni scholars, however, the term Dirayat al-Hadith, or sometimes Diraya for short, is most commonly used. And for these scholars, the term Usulul Hadith has come to refer to their main books of Hadith. The formation of Dirayat al-Hadith should be taken to be a result of extensive interaction between scholars of Hadith or Muhaddithun, scholars of jurisprudence or Fuqaha, and those of theology or what we call the Mutakallimun. For Sunni scholars, some issues of Dirayat al-Hadith came under focus since the period of the Prophet's companions or Sahaba. There are cases of works written about some issues of Dirayat al-Hadith which date back to the late 2nd century after Hijrah or early 9th century Common Era. Imam Shafi'i is the first to have written about this in his Ar-Risala. Some terminologies of Hadith-related disciplines are formed in the 3rd century after Hijrah or 9th century Common Era. In this period, scholars of Hadith and the science of Rijal discuss some issues of Dirayat al-Hadith in the introduction of their books. Issues such as the manners of hearing a Hadith and delivering it to others, types of acceptable and unacceptable Hadith, and classes of narrators of Hadith. According to Nuruddin al-Ilal by at-Tirmidhi, which is published at the end of his collection of Hadith known as Jami' at-Tirmidhi, is distinguished for its definitions of some terms in Dirayat al-Hadith. In the next lesson, we will deal with the contributory factors to the emergence of Dirayat al-Hadith, inshallah. For more similar lessons, subscribe to Wayfaring with Mansoor channel. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.